from the book of Esther. Now, I know I was going through Nehemiah. I couldn't quite remember how far we got, if I'm honest. Perhaps, secretly people are quite pleased. I don't know. So Esther lived at a similar kind of time. And as I was preparing yesterday, it struck me it's actually a rather difficult book from which to preach. So we'll read together from chapter 1 into the beginning of verse 2. Chapter 1 of Esther and verse 1. I'm reading from the New King James Version. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast, lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and purple marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic platform of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. I'll leave it there for now. So Esther begins at a time in the Persian Empire when it's really at its greatest. If you think about empires, an empire is basically when one country takes over everybody else's country. Empires kind of like peak and then they kind of wane again. If you think of the British Empire, some of you might be able to remember the British Empire. Not sure I can. But the British Empire, around 1924, covered more land than it had ever covered before. Within a generation, it had lost much of it. Again, empires come and empires go. The Roman Empire started small, and then it kind of faded away. The Persian Empire, in this section of Esther, is the biggest, most powerful it will ever be. And it has a new king called Ahasuerus. Now, that's his Hebrew name. He has a Persian name. And when I was practicing, I thought, I'll never say it right. It's Keshayarasha, I beg your pardon. There you go. I got it wrong. His Greek name, though, is more common, Xerxes. If you've seen that film 300, Xerxes is portrayed as a rather kind of camp giant. I don't think he was like that. But Xerxes was one of the most powerful men, one of the most richest men in history, and he's decided to throw a party. Now, you know that when a rich man throws a party, it's going to be pretty impressive. And that is exactly as he does. Now, it says it's the 3rd year of his reign. For the first 3 years of his reign, he had to quell rebellions in Egypt and Babylonia. It took 3 years. 3 years into the reign, the empire is now at peace and he wants to throw his party. Not to celebrate becoming king, but to celebrate consolidating his empire. He's established himself. So he invites all the leaders of his empire to his capital to have a great party. It's also their way of proving their loyalty to him. And we get details of splendor, marble and silver rods and fine linen and purple, curtains with cords of I don't know, curtains and things don't really interest me. What I think the point is making is that it was very well decorated. It was lovely. He had a great eye, great taste. I said before that Esther is a difficult book from which to preach. And one of the chief reasons for that is God is not mentioned. Now, that's surprising to many people. Surely, a book of the Bible would be mentioned an awful lot. God would be mentioned a lot. But he's not mentioned at all. But one of the points I'm going to make to you, and I'm going to make it in closing, and I'm going to make it here in starting, is that God might not be mentioned, but he's quietly and sovereignly working behind the scenes. We used to have a wonderful old-fashioned word for it, which we don't tend to hear much anymore. It was providence. The providence of God. And the book begins with a powerful man throwing a party. But it soon becomes clear that Xerxes is not as powerful as he thinks. For there is a God in heaven, working behind the scenes, pulling strings, moving players. In the book of Esther, some commentators say it's like a game of chess. Various people move, and various people move as a reaction to that. But there is an invisible player moving behind the scenes. Interestingly as well, I believe there's another player moving behind the scenes. If you know the book of Esther, you'll know that it really is a plot to destroy the Jewish people. And the crescendo of the book is Queen Esther's deliverance of the Jewish people. And ordinary Jews today, who are not perhaps especially religious, they know about Esther. They know about Purim, that celebration of what happened in the book of Esther. And God is moving behind the scenes, and so is that roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Have you noticed in history how many attempts there have been to destroy the Jewish nation? That's partly because the Messiah would come from the Jewish nation. And Satan didn't want that to happen. And God made a promise with the Jewish nation. So even later on, Satan's plan has been to try and foil and break the promises of God, which God will not allow to happen. So let me make it clear. You'll not see God, or you'll not see his name, but you'll see him working. You'll not even hear Satan, but you'll see him working. Notice also, there's a parallel, I think, here when it says that he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and all the splendor of his majesty for many days, 180 in all. I'm reminded when I read that of what we read in Matthew chapter 4, verse 8. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. Of course, it wasn't Satan's to give. But one point I want to make here is that wealth in this world is never ours to keep. What you own, what you have, one day will belong to another. Your house, the land that you work, one day it will belong to another. Xerxes, mighty king of Persia, was eventually stabbed to death by his own bodyguards. His land and his wealth went to his son. Eventually he died and he went to someone else. And I believe that the writer of the book of Esther, who, by the way, I suspect was Nehemiah, who else would have such a knowledge of the Persian court? He's writing a couple of generations later on, except Nehemiah. There may have been other people, can't prove it. He never mentions his name. But I believe that it's with some irony that the writer says, then he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days. Friends, there is one whose splendor and majesty will be exhibited for more than many days. It will be for an entire eternity. Someone asked me the other day, what will heaven be like? They had the impression it was like going to a posh hotel and there's not very much entertainment laid on. And I said, it's not like that. We cannot be bored in heaven because we might spend 10 million years just gazing at him who sits upon the throne. And the beauty and the majesty of God in heaven would more than satisfy a curious and inquisitive spirit. Here is a king who by earthly standards is majestic and glorious, but his glory and his majesty comes to an end. Notice also we're told that the king did not make drinking compulsory. The king had ordered all officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. I'm pretty sure that means they all got drunk. So the scene is set by saying there's an extravagant king throwing an extravagant party. In verses 9 to 15, though, his party goes a little bit wrong, and he's made to look foolish. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that's a polite way of putting it, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, unfortunate name, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. There's something rather seedy about that passage. The king wants to show off Queen Vashti because of her beauty. He's showing off all his other possessions. He's showing off all his riches. Now he wants to show off his queen. Why does she refuse? Well, it might be that she does not wish to be exhibited before a bunch of drunken nobles, and they almost certainly were drunk and leering. That might have been her reason. It might be, interestingly, that she was heavily pregnant. We know that she gave birth to the king's son that year. So she's either pregnant or she's given birth, and quite frankly, she's probably got better things on her mind. That's King Artaxerxes, who was being born that year, who's the king mentioned in Ezra chapter 7. It might be that she herself had been drinking one or two too many. You know, Christians for at least since the 19th century, many of them have been very temperate when it came to drink. Many Christians chose not to drink. And here there is an object lesson when a drunken king orders a possibly drunken queen to do something, and for them, things all appear to go wrong. It might be that she was a little bit peeved by the fact that she wasn't invited to the main celebrations. In verse 9, she and the women are having a separate kind of celebration. We don't know why Vashti refuses. And yet here we see now the sovereignty of God. Do you remember when Saul was king of Israel? And God told him that he had chosen someone better. There's a young lass living in Susa. We've not yet been introduced to her. And so far, her life has been pretty rotten. But God, in his power and his sovereignty, is preparing her to be queen. And he uses this decision, a rather irrational decision, I ought to add, of Queen Vashti, to bring his own person into that power, of that position of responsibility. Another message, perhaps, of the book of Esther is that the decisions we make have far-reaching consequences. Vashti chose not to appear before the king, and as a result, she was deposed. In verse 12, we get the king's reaction. He was furious, and we're told his anger burned within him. I cannot help but notice that the writer is enjoying the irony. Here is a king who has quelled 3 years' worth of rebellion, who is the greatest potentate in the Middle East. He's conquered Egypt, he's conquered Babylon, he's conquered everywhere within reach. His empire includes Ethiopia, the borders of Ethiopia, the borders of India. He's preparing to go and invade Greece. He is a world ruler. But he can't even run his own household. The queen says, nah, I'm not going. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4, Paul lays out some of the qualifications for being an elder. He says, not dependent on wine, not violent but gentle, peaceable and free of the love of money. An overseer must manage his own household well and keep his children under control with complete dignity. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he care for the church of God? Now, admittedly, Xerxes was not applying to become an elder in his local church. There were no local churches, and I don't think he'd have wanted to be an elder. But there in those qualifications, here is a king who is dependent on wine. Here is a king who is not free from the love of money. And here is a king who cannot show control over his own household. He's humiliated. He's embarrassed. He brought all these nobles together to impress them, and his wife is not interested. He's been made to look foolish. In verse 13 we're told, the king said to the wise men who understood the times, this was the king's manner towards all who knew law and justice, those closest to him, and here we have some more names, Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? Who are these men? Well, we don't know. He calls them wise men. Now, we know that Daniel, in a previous generation, had been in charge of the wise men of Babylon. And it might well be that these princes are essentially the chief magi of the empire, whose job is to know the times. Could it be that they knew their leader Daniel's prophecy? That as the Babylonian Empire would end, so one day would the Persian Empire end. They know the times. They're looking for the time when one empire, the current one, will also fall. Xerxes at that time is preparing a massive invasion of Greece, which, by the way, fails. And the last thing they want is some kind of domestic rebellion in the king's own palace between the king and the queen. Maybe that's what it means by they understood the times. Or it might just be that they were chief princes who were quite smart and they're part of his cabinet. Either way, we're not altogether clear. But they come up with a plan. Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. The poor nobles of Persia. They fear that because of what Queen Vashti has done, they'll go home and their wives will be the same to them. Come here, wife. No! They wouldn't want that now, would they? If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the lords of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Memucan thinks he is a wise man. He's come up with a solution that pleases the king, a solution that might possibly allow him to plant his own kind of queen and thus increase his own influence. And it's also a way of keeping his own wife quiet when he gets home. I said it before. I say it again. Someone else is working behind the scenes. The God in heaven has already chosen she who is better than Vashti. God had a plan all along that a Jewish girl, an orphaned Jewish girl, would become Queen of Persia. And through the counsels of Memucan, through the obstinacy of the queen, through the pride of the king, God's purpose is unfolding. Verse 20, when the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honour their husbands, both great and small. We get here also a glimpse into the foolishness of human law. The Persians and the Medes had a custom whereby once the king made a law, it could never ever be repealed. It could never be retracted. You can't ever change your mind. Our parliament passes laws. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. But a future parliament can always undo them. The Persian constitution, such as it was, said you cannot ever undo a law. It's also quite a foolish law that you make while you're drunk to apply to everybody in your empire. I mean, are the good wives of Persia really going to become more obedient because of this law? I'm not convinced that they would be. The reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the languages of his own people. The chapter begins with a description of Xerxes in all his splendor, his brilliance. He is a magnificent king. At the end of the chapter, for me, he cuts something of a pathetic figure. His own wife won't obey him, and therefore he feels the need to send a letter to basically everybody saying, please obey your husbands. Here is a king who thought he controlled an empire. He's actually quite powerless. You see, human power is fleeting. I'm not going to indulge in political commentary. But a number of people on Thursday or Friday morning this week who thought they had power and wanted power, and they're not going to get it. Wealth is fleeting. Power is fleeting. But the God in heaven who works behind the scenes is still in control. Chapter 2, verse 1. I'm not going to read very far into chapter 2, but it will give us some more spiritual content. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. The next morning, or afternoon, by the time he gets up, he regretted it. He remembered the woman he is now no longer able to see. He's sobered. Then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So because the king regrets that foolish decision he probably made, although we know God was behind it, his servants have to cheer him by saying, right, we're going to organise a massive beauty contest, and you get to pick whichever one you want to be queen. And it said the idea pleased him. Well, of course it did. Then in verse 5, we come to a different household. So far we've read about the king and we've read about the queen and their eunuchs and their wise men and their princes and their parties and their purple curtains and the marble. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Mordecai has not had a great life. His great-grandfather had an even worse life. With Daniel, he was carried away from Jerusalem, forced to live in Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon. We sat down and wept. Yea, we remembered Zion. And the Jews call it their captivity. Now, gradually, the Persian kings had allowed the Jews to return. But this Jew has not returned. And he's now the fourth generation of Jew living in a foreign country. And he might have been thinking for much of his life, why am I still here? Why have I not been allowed to return? Lord, what good am I to you in Persia when I should be back in Jerusalem? Why do you keep me here? Have you ever asked why your life has gone down a particular path? And you're saying, oh Lord, why did you allow that to happen? Well, we know the rest of the book. We know why Mordecai was there. Because God's plan was being worked out. Mordecai is actually a pagan name. It's Mardoku in the text. It means servant of Marduk. Marduk was a Babylonian god. Again, if you remember Daniel and the Hebrew children in the furnace, they were given new pagan names. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. And evidently Mordecai has been given a pagan name. Interestingly, people have found records from this very time, and they found a Mardoku who was an accountant living in Susa. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against accountants. They do a wonderful job. But Mordecai was descended from King Saul. And now he's an accountant living in Persia. If ever you wanted a kind of respectable but not very exciting life, Mordecai has it. Of course, he may not have been an accountant. It might be a different Mordecai. But what we do know is that so far his life's been pretty rotten. His grandfather lost everything and was carried off to Babylon, and he is still there as a result. In fact, you might trace his woes back even further. He belongs to the wrong royal family. Saul was displaced from the royal throne of Israel and replaced by David. He belongs to the previous dynasty. He could have been king one day, but no, he's an accountant living in Persia. What am I doing here, Lord? Surely I should be doing something better, something else. The Lord puts us where he puts us. You might think your life's a bit dull. God doesn't. You might think, what am I doing here? If God has put you there, believe me, he knows what he's doing. And he knew what he was doing with Mordecai, the Jew. It goes on. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah. That is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. If Mordecai thought he had had a pretty bad deal from life, Hadassah, also known as Esther, had even more grounds for complaint. She too was descended from the wrong royal family. She too found herself a captive in a foreign land. But she'd had a pretty miserable childhood as well. Not only has she lost one parent, in fact, she lost both. Those two people that every child ought to have grown up with, They ought to have played with her, brought her up, taught her how to do things, took her to the park to play. They couldn't because God had taken them. And if Esther ever said, Lord, why did you allow that to happen to me? Perhaps, just perhaps, we might have sympathy for her indeed. Why did God take away from her those two people who were most precious? We don't know. Maybe Esther knows now. But what we do know is that they were taken away. And that Mordecai, the man who'd been given a pagan name, the man whose great-grandfather had been deported, he takes her in. Again, says nothing of God, does it? Let me assure you. God allows tragedy because it provides you and I with opportunity. I'm looking forward to the day when Eden will be restored, when Christ will return. The lion and the lamb will lay together. I'm looking forward to that day, and I believe it's coming. But in this mucked up old world in which we live, remember this. Somebody else's suffering is God's call to you to be compassionate. Somebody being in want is God's call to you to be generous. Somebody being annoying is God's call to you to be patient. Because of the wicked world in which we live, because of the bad things that happen, God has provided and created glorious opportunities for you as the people of God to shine. And Mordecai had the opportunity to bring up this little girl, and he took her in. And Mordecai looks after Esther. And this alliance, this familial partnership, is all part of God's plan from the beginning. The book of Esther does not dwell on the fact that she was an orphan. It doesn't need to. It dwells on the outworking of God's providence from the very beginning to the very end of the book. We're told that she was lovely and beautiful. For many young Persian women at that time, that was a prison sentence because it means you get to join the king's harem and you might have your one special night, and after that you're kind of locked away in the hope he might call for you and send for you. That's what might have happened to Esther. But Esther's God is on the throne. And Esther's God knows what's going to happen. And Esther's God has a plan for her. When her mother and father died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. It's not clear whether Esther voluntarily went to the palace or she was taken. The grammar has her as the passive partner. She was taken. I'm pretty sure that Esther possibly didn't want to go. To be just another woman. To be used by a spoilt king. Her name means myrtle. Esther means star. If you know the myrtle flower, it looks like a star. I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to ask the question. Can you see a parallel between your life and Esther's? Because sometimes events move and other people move and we are kind of influenced and affected by it, and sometimes we don't appear to be in control of our own lives and we say, Lord, where are you? What's going on? The message of the book of Esther to you this morning is that even when bad things happen, even when powerful people do what they do, God is still in control, and your times are in his hands. God's providence, that is the outworking of his promises and his plans. God's providence is operating even when it doesn't feel like it. Don't ever base your theology on your feelings. Feelings come and feelings go. Xerxes based a law upon his feelings and regretted it the next day. No, let me read to you from Job chapter 11. Can you discover the depths of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? They are high as the heavens. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Such is the wisdom of God. When things happen to me that I do not like and I do not understand, can I not still acknowledge that his wisdom is greater than mine will ever be? Jesus said in the 10th of Matthew, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered, so do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows. Esther must have felt like a cheap piece of meat, taken to the palace to please the king. Yet another episode in her life, like the loss of her parents, when things have happened and she's been carried off in one direction and there's nothing she could do to stop it. Maybe you feel like that as well. Well, let me say to you, you are worth more than many sparrows. And even the most least significant of the birds, God knows. And let me close this time with Paul. Very predictable, but a most apt verse with which to close. Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. God is still on the throne. He's still sovereign. And his good providence will still and always take care of you, even when things are out of your control. Amen.